In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the demand for labour. There's various bits that this can be broken down into, so you might want to stop to sort of shut me up at various points. The first thing to realise is that labour is a derived demand. So workers are employed because of what they can produce. So for example, those airline pilots for EasyJet wouldn't have their jobs if those people didn't want to go on holiday. By the way, EasyJet only employ 5% of female pilots, but they're trying to do something about that. So if we have the market for goods on the left hand side, pretty much that's duplicated by the market for labour on the right hand side. So if the demand for the good goes up on the left hand side, leading to an increase in price and an increase in quantity, then demand for labour goes up on the right hand side, leading to an increase in wages and an increase in the number of people employed. This could be a place to stop. So if you want to draw the demand curve and supply curve of labour just like an ordinary demand and supply curve for labour, that's fine, but you might want to be a little bit more subtle than that. So the theory behind the labour demand is the marginal productivity theory of labour. So let's say that we employ a worker and they are able to produce 3 units. So because the total number of units has gone up from 0 to 3, their marginal productivity is 3 units. If we employ a second worker, the chances are they're going to be able to work well together, perhaps employing division of labour. So total output goes up from 3 to 7, which means that that second worker adds a marginal output of 4. And when we get that third worker, we're able to increase our output to 13 because they're working very well together now. And so the marginal productivity is another 6 because output has gone up from 7 to 13. Now with the fourth worker, things start to get a little bit more tricky because maybe they're starting to run out of machinery to work with. You might be running out of room. So total output may still go up from 13 to 16, but it's only rising by 3, whereas it was rising by 6 before. And with that fifth worker employed, we're still getting a little bit of extra output, but it's only gone up from 16 to 17. Possible, incidentally, that total output may actually fall if they get in each other's way, but not in this example. So it's gone up from 16 to 17, a marginal output of 1. So now we have a law, the law of diminishing returns. It's not a theory like demand is a theory, it's a law. In other words, it will always and everywhere be the case. And the law just says that if we increase a factor of production, labour, by 1 unit, with all other factors of production being held constant, at some point there's going to be a decrease in the marginal product, in the marginal output. No, it does not say that total output will decrease. It might do, but the marginal output at one point will definitely decrease. So how do we show this on a diagram? Well, initially, marginal product goes up because of division of labour and the workers working well together. But at some point, that rate of increase stops, and it's at that point that diminishing returns sets in. So it's like it's an inverse tick. So that's that law. However, remember that firms do not employ workers from what they can produce. They employ workers because they can sell what those workers produce. So we're not interested in the marginal productivity. We're interested in converting that into revenue, called the marginal revenue product. And it's pretty easy to get it. We simply multiply the price the product is selling for by the marginal output of that worker to find their marginal revenue product. So for example, if a worker adds 200 units of output a month and that output sells for £10 a unit, then the marginal revenue product is 200 times £10 equals £2,000 a month. So logically, if that worker costs the firm in wages more than £2,000 a month, then it's unprofitable to employ the worker. So they'll be not employed or told to sling their hook. But if the wage is less than £2,000 a month, then the firm can add to their profit by employing the worker. Now the cut-off point is where the value of the output of the marginal worker, their marginal revenue product, is exactly equal to the marginal wage, the extra wages that the firm has to pay when they're employing them. So it's marginal revenue product equals marginal wage. If you've done theory of the firm, you'll realise that that is exactly the same as the general profit maximisation condition, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So how do we show this on a diagram? Well, let's get back to our original diagram for diminishing returns. And this is the diagram for the marginal revenue productivity, or the demand curve for labour. It's exactly the same because it's simply the marginal product multiplied by the price. And that's it for that bit. So again, this could be a pause point. So under what circumstances will the demand curve for labour shift to the right? Well, we've already said that if the demand for the product goes up, then the demand for the labour producing that product goes up. Equally, if the revenue derived from selling that product, in other words, the revenue product goes up, then again, that will make workers more attractive. Or if the other part of marginal revenue product, the product bit, if that goes up, then that's likely to make firms want to employ more workers because they're more productive. What about the factors that determine whether it's a steep inelastic curve for labour or if it's a shallow curve? Well, the first obvious point is that if the demand for the product is elastic, then the demand for the labour that makes that product is likely to be more elastic. And the other factors are very similar to the elasticity of demand for a product, except that we then turn them into the labour market. So in the product market, if there's lots of competition, then the demand for the product is elastic. Well, in the labour market, the equivalent of that, if loads of people can do the job, then that makes demand for that labour elastic. So for example, lots of people could be cleaners if pushed. Not many people could become brain surgeons because they haven't got the skills or the aptitudes. So the demand for cleaners is likely to be more elastic. The demand for brain surgeons is likely to be inelastic. Now, one that we can look at is the equivalent of the high percentage of a consumer's income. Now, the equivalent of that is if that particular labour makes up a high percentage of a firm's costs, then if that labour was to get a pay rise, that would make firms really start to look at whether they need that quantity of labour. So, for example, imagine in a college that the total budget is 20 million quid and teachers get 15 million of that, and the chief exec gets paid 100,000. Well, if the teachers were to get a 10% pay rise, that would add £1.5 million to the teachers' pay bill. So the college would be thinking, can we actually afford this? Should, if that happens, do we need to get rid of a few teachers, which would make them elastic? However, a 50% pay rise for the principal will only add £50,000 to the total expenditure of the college. And so that isn't going to be as important to the college as a 10% pay rise for the teachers. This is sometimes used in business to justify huge pay rises to chief execs and executives who already get a very large sum of money, while denying pay rises to the workers. And this particularly becomes relevant because most chief execs are white males, so it tends to add to income, to gender and race-based inequality, which we look at on another video. Again, when we look at the product market, one of the things we look at is whether the product is a luxury or not. And the same is true in the labour market. So there are some jobs that are absolutely vital, so they will be inelastic. So for example, you can't open a school or college if the caretakers are not there to open it. So they're actually vital. Similarly, in lots of factories, the electricians are absolutely vital, because if they are not there and there's a breakdown, then that will have an immediate impact on the organisation. Frequently, you'll find in times of trouble, firms will get rid of workers that they regard as slightly peripheral. For example, the trainers or the PR staff. They don't result in an immediate benefit to the organisation. So frequently, you'll see these are the first people to lose their jobs in a cutback. So trainers, PR, elastic, security staff, or electricians, very, very, very inelastic. In the product market, if it's easy for consumers to switch, for example, if say you've got an old style camera, you can easily switch to a mobile phone to take photos, then that makes demand for cameras elastic. The equivalent for that in the labour market is if it's easy for an item of capital equipment to replace that labour. So in the old days, if you wanted a cup of coffee and you were in an office, then someone would physically push a tea trolley around and deliver it for you. These days, it tends to be done by a coffee machine. So you go and get your own coffee. That picture of that little old lady, she's an exception to that. She's managed to keep her job. Other examples would be things like word processors replacing typists, and spreadsheets are being used to replace a number of accountants. Accountants used to be basically number crunchers. Now they're number analyzers because of that. And the final factor in the product market is time. The longer you've got, the more you can change the products you buy. Same's true in the labour market. Could be a good place to pause. So to pick up the odd evaluation mark, we need to be able to check to see how useful this theory is in practice. Well, where we can directly measure the revenue productivity, it's pretty useful. For example, car mechanics do work on a car. The customer is charged, so it's fairly straightforward to work out the value of that worker. Similarly, a double glazing salesperson is going to go around and they're going to get some business, and so we can measure the value of the business that that person has got us. Solicitors deal with cases, those cases are charged. So where that happens, reasonable theory. Now, it's not bad where there's a link, an obvious link with revenue productivity. So, for example, Ronaldo was transferred for £13 million, and it's possible vaguely to measure his productivity, goals, assists, the number of points, whether Man United get into Europe, whether they win the league, whether they win the cup. You could look at the impact on gates, you can look at the impact on sponsorships, so not bad. Similarly, train drivers, they will drive passengers a certain number of passenger miles, and those passengers will be paying for their tickets. So there is a link there, not as strong as with the top group. Now, with many jobs, you can measure the productivity, but you can't really measure the revenue productivity. For example, I'm a teacher. You could measure my productivity by the number of students I teach, or by the number of grades, the amount of grades that they manage to get. What about the revenue productivity? Well, you'd have to then know what the individual students then do and get their jobs, and then somehow you've got to work that back to me as to how much my teaching is worth. In practice, very difficult to do that. Similarly with nurses, it may not even be possible to measure the productivity of a night nurse. She might be sitting doing nothing, or she might be dealing with an emergency case. How to turn that into money, really difficult. Cleaners, again, possible to measure the productivity. What about the revenue productivity? Or hotel receptionists, same thing. So for that, and there's an awful lot of people in that particular circumstance, it's really difficult to measure that. And there are a number of jobs where it isn't even possible to measure the productivity. For example, you could be a security guard, or a night security guard in particular. You could simply be monitoring what is going on by looking at screens throughout the night, and nothing happens at all. So how can you actually measure their productivity, let alone their revenue productivity? Now think about a number of the workers in your school or college, or workers that you see around. Where would you group those into these 4 different items? And I'm willing to bet some of them you'll just about be able to make a link. I doubt whether there's going to be many where you can make that direct link. So how useful is it? How long's a piece of string? That's enough of this.